Listen closely, because the United States is teetering on the edge of a financial cliff, and the fall could drag the entire world down with it. The question is no longer if a crisis is coming, but when it will hit and how devastating it will be. We are talking about the very real possibility of the US government defaulting on its debt for the first time in history. This isn't a distant academic problem. This is an immediate threat with a deadline that is just weeks away. Forget everything else you've heard about the economy for a moment and focus on this, because it is the single most important financial story of our time. The countdown has already begun. Let's get straight to the numbers because they are staggering. As of right now, in the middle of 2025, the United States national debt has ballooned to an almost incomprehensible $36.2 trillion. To put that in perspective, that is more than the entire economies of China, Japan, Germany, and the United Kingdom combined. This mountain of debt isn't just one single loan, it's broken down into two main parts. About $29 trillion of it is what's called debt held by the public. This is the money the government owes to individuals, corporations, and foreign governments who have bought US Treasury bonds. They bought these bonds because they were considered the safest investment on planet Earth. The other $7.2 trillion is intragovernmental holdings. This is essentially money the government owes to itself, moving funds from one pocket to another, like from the Social Security Trust Fund into the Treasury's general fund. But don't let that detail fool you. It's all real money that has been spent and must be paid back. So how did we get here? How did we rack up a bill this massive? The answer is simple and relentless. We spend far more than we bring in, year after year, decade after decade. This isn't a new problem, but it has accelerated dramatically. In this fiscal year alone, 2025, the federal government is projected to run a deficit of around $1.9 trillion. Data from the US Treasury for the first 8 months of the fiscal year already shows a deficit of $1.4 trillion, which is a chilling $160 billion higher than the same period last year. This isn't happening in a vacuum. The debt is a direct result of policy choices. It's the cost of massive government programs and essential services, from our military to our infrastructure. It's the result of major stimulus packages designed to keep the economy afloat during crises. And, critically, it's the result of significant tax cuts that have drastically reduced government revenue without corresponding cuts in spending. The tax cuts passed by the previous administration in 2017, for instance, were projected to add trillions to the debt over a decade, and we are seeing the consequences of that choice playing out in real time. When you combine high spending with lower tax receipts, the debt is the inevitable result. The debt-to-GDP ratio, which measures the country's debt against its total economic output, remains stubbornly above 100%. This is a clear warning sign that our financial burden is becoming dangerously heavy for our economy to support. But a large debt on its own isn't the immediate crisis. The immediate crisis, the ticking time bomb, is something else entirely. It's a uniquely American political invention called the debt ceiling, and understanding this is key to understanding why we are so close to the edge. What is the debt ceiling? It is not, as many believe, a vote to authorize new spending. All the spending that has led to our $36.2 trillion debt has already been authorized by Congress through budgets and laws passed over many years. The debt ceiling is simply the legal limit on how much money the Treasury Department can borrow to pay for those existing, legally mandated obligations. It's like getting your credit card bill in the mail for things you already bought, and then having a separate debate about whether or not to pay the bill. It's a political tool that has been turned into a weapon of mass economic destruction, and right now, that weapon is pointed directly at the heart of the US economy. We have already hit the current debt limit. To keep paying the nation's bills, things like Social Security checks, salaries for our troops, payments to Medicare doctors, and interest on our existing debt, the Treasury Department has been forced to use what it calls extraordinary measures. These are essentially accounting tricks and financial maneuvers that allow the government to juggle funds and delay the inevitable for a few months. But those measures are running out. Soon, there will be no more tricks left. And that's when we hit the X date. The X date is the precise day when the United States government runs out of cash and can no longer pay all of its bills in full and on time. The Bipartisan Policy Center, a respected nonpartisan think tank, has projected that this date will likely arrive sometime between August 15 and October 3rd of this year, 2025. That means we have, at most, a few months, and potentially just a few weeks, before the United States government begins to default on its obligations. So what happens if we actually cross that line? What does a US default actually look like? It would be a catastrophe unlike anything we have ever seen. The risk of default is currently considered small, but as The Hill has reported, it is not zero, and the consequences of even a brief technical default would be immediate and severe. First, global financial markets would plunge into chaos. US Treasury bonds are the bedrock of the entire global financial system. They are the ultimate safe haven asset. Banks, pension funds, and central banks all over the world hold trillions of dollars in US debt because they believe it comes with a 0% chance of default. If that trust is broken, even for a day, it shatters the foundation of global finance. The value of those bonds would plummet. interest rates would skyrocket, not just for the US government, but for everyone. The dollar's status as the world's reserve currency would be called into question, leading to a seismic shift in global economic power. The impact at home would be just as devastating. Imagine waking up to find that interest rates on mortgages, car loans, and credit cards have shot up overnight. That's what would happen, as the cost of borrowing for everyone is tied to the interest rate on US government debt. The stock market would almost certainly crash, wiping out trillions of dollars in retirement savings and wealth. Businesses, unable to get affordable loans, would stop hiring and start laying people off. A deep, painful recession would not be a risk, it would be a certainty. But it gets even more personal. The government would face an impossible choice: who gets paid and who doesn't. Will it be the millions of seniors who depend on their Social Security checks to survive? Will it be the active duty soldiers fighting overseas who won't get their paychecks? Will it be the doctors and hospitals who treat Medicare patients? There is no good answer. A default means the government is failing to meet its legal obligations, and the human cost would be immense and immediate. This brings us to the paralyzing political reality of 2025. Avoiding this self-inflicted wound should be simple. Congress just needs to vote to raise or suspend the debt ceiling, allowing the Treasury to borrow the money needed to pay for spending that Congress has already approved. This has been done dozens of times in the past, under administrations from both political parties. But today, it has become a high-stakes game of political chicken. Some policymakers are demanding massive, immediate cuts to government spending in exchange for their vote to raise the debt limit. They argue that the nation's soaring debt is the true crisis, and that this is the only moment of leverage they have to force fiscal discipline. They point to the ongoing large deficits, which the Congressional Budget Office projects will exceed a staggering 7.5% of GDP in both 2025 and 2026, as proof that our current path is unsustainable. On the other side, many other policymakers, including those in the current administration, argue that holding the full faith and credit of the United States hostage is reckless and irresponsible. They contend that the debate over future spending and revenue should be separate from the non-negotiable duty to pay the country's existing bills. They point out that a default would do far more damage to the economy than the spending they are trying to cut, and that a robust economy is necessary to generate the tax revenue needed to pay down the debt over the long term. They also argue that any serious conversation about deficits must include not just spending cuts, but also revenue increases, potentially by reversing some of the tax cuts from prior years that have disproportionately benefited corporations and the wealthy. The result is a dangerous stalemate. While Washington debates, the X-date creeps closer. The fiscal policy of 2025 is trapped in this political gridlock. As the Congressional Budget Office confirms in its latest reports, recent tax and spending bills passed earlier this year are already projected to add trillions more to the deficit over the next decade. There is a profound disconnect between the rhetoric of fiscal responsibility and the actions being taken. Even with some stronger than expected tax revenues trickling in at the start of the year, the underlying structural problem remains. Federal spending continues to dramatically outpace revenues, a trend that is set to worsen as the population ages and costs for Social Security and Medicare continue to climb. The tragedy is that this is an entirely manufactured crisis. The long-term debt problem is very real and requires serious, bipartisan solutions. We need a national conversation about what we want our government to do and how we are willing to pay for it. That conversation will involve difficult choices about spending on everything from defense to social programs, and it will involve hard choices about taxes, but that is a separate battle. The immediate battle, the one that risks pushing us over the cliff in the next few weeks, is about the debt ceiling. It's about deciding whether to pay for yesterday's purchases. So, as we stand here in mid-2025, the situation is this. The United States is saddled with over $36 trillion in debt, fueled by structural deficits that show no sign of shrinking. The government's legal authority to borrow more money to pay its bills is exhausted. The Treasury is using emergency measures that will run out by late summer or early fall. If Congress fails to act before the X-date, the US will default. The consequences would be a self-inflicted economic depression, a global financial panic, and a permanent stain on America's credibility. The entire world is watching, waiting to see if America's political system is capable of performing its most basic function, honoring its commitments. The path forward requires immediate congressional action to defuse the debt ceiling bomb. After that, the much harder work of forging a sustainable long-term fiscal policy must begin. But one thing is crystal clear: failure is not an option. The stakes are too high. The clock is ticking, and time is running out to pull back from the brink. The future of American financial stability, and by extension, the stability of the global economy, hangs in the balance, waiting on a political decision that must be made before it's too late. The question on everyone's mind is, will they act in time?